In April 2005, then Prime Minister John Howard, when abolishing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, effectively cutting Indigenous peoples off from policy, stated that, "We believe very strongly that the experiment in separate representation, elected representation, for Indigenous people has been a failure." ATSIC was a popular scapegoat in government, politicians getting away with at best apathy and at worst hostility towards the Indigenous communities by blaming it on the weakness of their commission. Since the abolishment of ATSIC, there has been no new representative body for Indigenous people in the Australian state. Samson and Delilah was released in a post-Sorry Australia, with former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's speech having happened the year before. Words are nice, but they weren't followed by actions. Director Warwick Thornton said, "The sorry word was designed for our grandmothers, and it did work, but for the Samson and Delilahs of the world, it doesn't mean shit. When you're starving on the streets and you're homeless, that word just doesn't cut it." The film was made to show the reality for young Indigenous Australians outside of the white mainstream sunshine, rainbows and reconciliation after the sorry speech. There has always been a picture painted of Indigenous people in Australia, one that they themselves have had very little hand in creating. Indigenous people exist now in a world designed specifically to omit them altogether. Aboriginals are from picture books, the rainbow serpent, an image created to put them in their place and time, separated from modern Australia, leaving Indigenous people to navigate a society that questions their authenticity. They're left performing identity for the white man, still having to answer to the colony to prove they were somehow able to keep what was stolen from them. Native title is specifically designed to fail. How are you supposed to prove ongoing connection to land you were forcibly removed from? And who gets to decide what constitutes as proof? When identities are constructed with specific parameters to fill, an image to live up to, this has the power to constrain the possibilities of people's lives. How do you marry your indigeneity with your existence in the Australian state? These two things are mutually exclusive. We cannot invite Indigenous people into Australian society when it was built on their exclusion. How do you live on no man's land? When Western ontologies are given right of way and Indigenous knowledge is not, how can you enter into an agreement of ownership of land when ownership is not a thing in your universe? What do you sacrifice to preserve your culture in the white man's world? Indigenous people lead complex existences, outside of images imposed upon them, and Samson and Delilah pays no consideration to the white viewer left floundering trying to understand what it is that they're seeing. Because the reality is, no one is going to hold your hand through unfamiliar territory. Difference is a fundamental part of being human, and we must leave behind our culturally ingrained assumptions and understandings to truly appreciate the multiplicity of the human experience. Let's talk about assumptions. At the beginning of the film, you may assume that the dynamic between Samson and Delilah is a sexist dynamic. I mean, he threw a rock at her. But that assumption directly infringes upon our ability to understand the story being told. This is not my environment, so why am I examining it the way I examine my own? When you make assumptions like this, you are analysing this relationship within the Western frameworks of understanding. You assume that there is a universal category of man and that this category is the same thing everywhere. You assume that Samson is a man the same way a white man is a man. You assume that the dynamics between men and women are the same in this environment. And maybe they are. Maybe this is a sexist dynamic. I'm not saying it can't be. The point is, you can't assume to understand. You're a baby, completely new to this environment, and you have shed all prior understanding of everything to learn it all again from a new perspective. Samson is not a man the way a white man is a man. He's not even a man, he's a child. Gender and race are not perfectly compartmentalized boxes. Identity politics doesn't work as a series of equations. People are not made up of parts, they are a whole, and all their supposedly neat boxed identities are not actually boxed at all. They are all fused together, inseparable from each other. A white man is simply not the same as an Indigenous man. Man in this case does not mean the same thing. You cannot separate important aspects of a person's identity that directly influence how it manifests. So much of the film directly works to unsettle the white viewer from these preconceived assumptions. Most of the very little dialogue in the film is in Warlpiri, and the community's culture is directly depicted. Not represented, not explained, it's just there as it exists. Nana makes an offhand comment about thinking Samson is a good match for Delilah because of his skin, part of the kinship system that forms the basis of this society. Unexplained, this film has absolutely no interest in catering to a white viewer, and they, like all Indigenous people, are under no obligation to do so. This film shows the real people and complex lives behind the perceived archetypes. This is how real people exist in a country that wasn't made for them. The security guard follows Samson around the supermarket. Samson sniffs petrol every day to feel something other than the monotony of everyday life. The aunties beat Delilah after Nana's death as part of their cultural sorry business, one aspect of director Thornton's culture that he wishes to actually criticise. There is a depiction of the complicated relationship Indigenous people have with Christianity. Delilah gets abducted and raped by a group of white men, depicting the proclivity of racialised and gendered violence enacted on Indigenous women by white men. It's also a great example of how to approach a character getting raped in your film, i.e. don't fucking film it. Delilah then also begins sniffing petrol to cope. When Nana dies, Delilah cuts her hair off. When Samson believes Delilah is dead, he too cuts his hair, despite this typically being part of a woman's sorry business. This scene draws a direct correlation to the original Samson and Delilah from scripture. Perhaps the most direct depiction of opposition to white fantasies of Indigenous people and culture, in their own place and time, is the use of art in the film. Before Nana's death, Delilah spends her days helping her paint. The white man who runs the community store takes them into town to be sold. When Delilah herself arrives in Alice Springs, she sees her and Nana's art for sale in an upscale gallery for $22,000. Complete with a photo of Nana next to the price tag to sate the white buyer's fetish for authenticity. Broken hungry, Delilah steals painting supplies and makes new artwork to take to the gallery in hopes of selling it. The white man behind the counter barely acknowledges her, only taking a second to tell her he's not interested. Oblivious to the irony of her being the artist of his $22,000 piece in the front window. Delilah takes her painting to a strip of cafes, where the white customers uncomfortably refuse her. Later in the film, after her assault, Delilah makes a new, much darker painting and shoves it in customers' faces, putting her reality right in front of the willfully ignorant, as the film itself does. A waitress comes out and tells her if she doesn't leave, she will call the police, and Delilah barks out a laugh. She's the one being told to leave. Fundamentally, despite the impact this film has on its white viewers, this is a story about love, in direct opposition to adverse circumstances. Director Warwick Thornton stated that this is a film about people who are classed not even as people, let alone people who are allowed to love or have emotions. They're not allowed to be human. They are the untouchables. I believe that the story of these two young lovers, Samson and Delilah, is an important and unique story to tell. It's an untold story. The camera treats its characters with a tenderness seldom afforded, and Samson and Delilah get a happy ending. After coming off from his addiction, the last thing Samson does in this film is laugh. I would like to leave you with this scene. The image of the homeless man Gonzo living in squalor under a bridge, happily singing "We Have Survived" by No Fixed Address, perfectly encapsulating the constant struggle to unify Indigeneity with existing in white Australia. But it also plays into the film's message of hope, because it's true, despite it all, Indigenous people have survived, and you can't change that.